Okay, if you watched our previous video, you know that Guatemala has a claim to roughly 53% of Belizean territory, including parts of the Cayo and Belize districts, along with the entirety of the Stan Creek and Toledo districts, well north of the internationally accepted border along the Sarstún River. Some, however, advocate for more, suggesting Guatemala should annex the entirety of Belize, adding an additional 8,867 square miles of territory to the country and giving us a Greater Guatemala. But, wouldn't you know it, this isn't the only territorial dispute Guatemala has, or more accurately had, with one of its neighbors. I'm talking about Guatemala's claims to Chiapas. Yes, this is another episode about irredentism. Oh, and as always, for any of our subscribers out there, consider clicking on the bell to get all notifications. That way you'll never miss out on any upcoming videos. And even if you're not a subscriber, like roughly 90% of our viewers, you can always subscribe, like this video, or comment. It really does help out the channel and means a lot to us. Chiapas today is Mexico's southernmost state. It borders Oaxaca to the west, Veracruz to the northwest, Tabasco to the north, and several Guatemalan departments to the east and southeast. Chiapas is Mexico's 10th largest state in terms of land size and the 15th most populous. Its capital and largest city is Tuxtla Gutiérrez. That being said, it remains one of the country's most economically challenged states, with a per capita income at about 40% of the national median, and a multi-dimensional poverty rate of 75.5%, the highest in Mexico. The name Chiapas likely comes from the ancient city of Chiapan, which in Nahuatl, an Uto-Aztecan language, means the place where the chia sage grows. And random fact, but the first substantial wave of chia seed exports from Mexico to the United States was because of these guys. Don't know how many of you remember chia pets, but they were huge in the 1980s and early 1990s. Anyway, Chiapas has a long history, stretching back thousands of years. The Mocaya, a pre-Olmec culture for example, were likely cultivating corn and living in houses in southern Chiapas as early as 1500 BC. Guatemala's claim to Chiapas, however, goes back to 1524, when Spanish conquistadors led by Pedro Alvarado conquered the region. In 1609, Chiapas officially became part of the Captaincy General of Guatemala, an administrative division that was itself part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. The Captaincy General spanned much of Central America, including present-day Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, and of course, Guatemala. For the next 212 years, this is where Chiapas remained. Despite this, it was relatively isolated from colonial authorities in Mexico City and Guatemala. One reason for this was that rugged terrain discouraged significant European settlement. Another was that much of Chiapas was not really economically attractive to the Spanish. It lacked mineral wealth, large areas of arable land, and easy access to markets elsewhere in the New World. And perhaps because of this, Chiapas initially referred to the area surrounding the first two cities established by the Spanish, Ciudad Real and Chiapa de Corzo, in what is now the center of the state. Further south, however, another region also existed, Soconusco. What's important to know here is that, in 1790, Chiapas and Soconusco were united as part of the Bourbon Reforms, a series of political and economic changes introduced by the Spanish crown under the various kings of the House of Bourbon. By 1821, however, Spain was on the verge of losing its colonial empire in the New World during the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. And while the Army of the Three Guarantees was advancing on Mexico City, Chiapas, along with the rest of the Captaincy General of Guatemala, declared independence from Spain. Oh, and in case you're wondering, the Army of the Three Guarantees guaranteed: 1. Mexico would be a Catholic empire, 2. It would be independent from Spain, and 3. It would be united against its enemies. Following the Mexican War of Independence, the Captaincy General then voluntarily joined the First Mexican Empire. However, the emperor was overthrown by Republican forces in 1823 during the Casa Mata Plan Revolution. While most of Central America quickly rejoined Guatemala, forming a new state, the United Provinces of Central America, which soon was renamed as the Federal Republic of Central America, Chiapas instead opted to declare itself an independent free state, the Free State of Chiapas, and a provisional government was set up in Ciudad Real. That being said, both the Supreme Executive Power, aka the Provisional Government of Mexico, and the FRCA laid claim to Chiapas. In the centuries following the Spanish conquest of Chiapas, two main regional identities developed in the territory. The Chiapas highlands, centered around cities like Ciudad Real, had stronger economic and cultural ties to Mexico due largely to trade with Veracruz, while Soconusco, a region wedged between the Sierra Madre de Chiapas mountains and the Pacific Ocean, had closer ties with Guatemala owing to its geography. Neither side was happy with maintaining the status quo, and so after months of debate, in September 1824, Mexican and local government officials, mainly from the Chiapas highlands, decided to hold a referendum on whether the Free State would join Mexico or the FRCA. The FRCA rejected this, however, arguing Chiapas had been a part of the Captaincy General of Guatemala before joining the First Mexican Empire and therefore was to remain a part of its territory. Mexico didn't really seem to care though, and the referendum went ahead as planned. About 60% voted in favor of joining Mexico, while 40% preferred becoming a part of the FRCA. As might be expected, most of those who voted in favor of annexation by Mexico were from the Chiapas highlands, while Soconusco strongly opposed annexation. For its part, the FRCA challenged the results of the referendum, citing voting irregularities, limited participation of indigenous communities, and the presence of Mexican forces stationed in parts of Chiapas. What's more, Soconusco refused to abide by the results, instead declaring its neutral status, which in effect saw the region become a de facto part of the FRCA and later Guatemala. That being said, in 1842, under President Antonio López de Santa Anna, Mexico felt enough was enough and, seeking to consolidate its borders, sent a military force to Soconusco to enforce its claim. Guatemala protested diplomatically but did not militarily contest Mexico's occupation of Soconusco, as it was then politically unstable owing to the collapse of the FRCA and Rafael Carrera's rise to power, and it also lacked the military means to do so. Some minor clashes between Mexican forces and pro-Guatemalan militias in Soconusco did occur, however, but these were not part of an organized military campaign by Guatemala. In the 19th century, Mexico faced a series of internal crises ranging from the Reform War to French intervention, and so it initiated talks with Guatemala aimed at permanently defining the two countries as of then still disputed border. Mexico, however, made it clear it considered the status of Chiapas and Soconusco as non-negotiable, arguing the 1824 referendum had legally settled the matter. And so, despite his reservations, Guatemalan President Justo Rufino Barrios signed the Treaty of Limits on September 27, 1882, which, among other things, saw Guatemala officially recognize Mexico's sovereignty over Chiapas and Soconusco. A bilateral commission was also established to physically demarcate the two countries' border and, in doing so, prevent future territorial disputes. The legacy of Mexico's annexation of Chiapas and Soconusco nonetheless still cuts deep in Guatemala, with some referring to the series of events that ultimately culminated in the 1882 Treaty of Limits as La Mexicana. This process is viewed as a form of territorial loss, not all that different from how some in Mexico see their country's loss of land to the United States in wake of the Mexican-American War. In short, Guatemala did not consent to nor recognize the 1824 referendum in Chiapas. Despite this, it was used by Mexico as justification for its military occupation of Soconusco in 1842. It was then used again in negotiating the 1882 Treaty of Limits, which finalized the Mexico-Guatemala border under terms heavily favoring Mexico. And thus, while Guatemala's claims to Chiapas and Soconusco were diplomatically settled, some Guatemalans continue to see it as an unjust loss of land that historically was Guatemalan. Anyway, I'm going to give Guatemala's claim to Chiapas a 2 on the Ghost Countries Index. It's not that I don't think there is a historical basis to it, it's just I believe the matter is more or less settled with the signing of the 1882 Treaty of Limits. Now, things could always change. Guatemala is currently awaiting a ruling by the International Court of Justice regarding its claims to Belizean territory. If you'd like to learn more about that, check out our video. And while I don't think the court is going to rule in Guatemala's favor, if it did, that might reignite discussions about Chiapas and Soconusco. I'm not saying it's likely, but there is a possibility. I don't, however, think there's a chance of Mexico, or any country for that matter, handing over the territory willingly. I mean, I guess it did happen with Sudan and South Sudan, but that's a different situation. We'll also kind of have to see what happens with Bougainville and Papua New Guinea in 2027, but that's still a different story completely. Also, a huge thank you once again to all of our supporters over on Patreon, and if you'd like to help support the channel too, there's a link down in the description.